Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
We assume that's the Bahamas. 544 miles per hour, 46, 56 degrees.
So I'll give you a little bit of background on what episodic memory is and how it's processed within the brain. So I'll talk about, this is really in the style of lectures that I give at Bowdoin. So hopefully it will be getting a little more interesting out of my, when we get past my outline here. But I'm going to talk quickly about different types of memory, specifically focusing on episodic memory. This is memory for events in your past. When you tell somebody, you know, I'm talking about memory, usually that's what they're assuming that you're talking about, although there are many other types of memory, which I'll mention. I'll briefly talk about the neural basis of episodic memory. This is a very brief summary of, you know, a literature of research going back 50 years. So this is sort of the current thinking on episodic memory. And then specifically I'll focus on one theory. There are many, many theories. This is sort of my pet theory of episodic memory and how it's processed within the brain. It's called the indexing theory of memory. And then I'll pose a couple discussion questions that we can think about as you're watching the film. So there are many different types of memory. There's not just one form of memory. There's lots of different types of memory. The sort of fastest, quickest sensory processing types of memory are iconic and echoic memory. These are things like if you see a flash of light for a split second after that flash goes away, you'll still have that image on your retina. That's still considered a form of memory because it's present in your brain, in your neural system after the stimulus has gone away. Same thing with echoic, it's just with auditory information. Then there's short-term, or what we now call working memory. This is sort of things that you're currently working on. So if if somebody tells you their name and you want to try to remember it, you might be rehearsing it, over and over in your head and thinking about it currently. And whatever you're sort of currently working on is working memory. And then what I study is the long-term memory. So there's lots of even subdivisions within long-term memory. There's memories that you can declare, declarative memories, things that if I asked you what you did yesterday, you would be able to tell me, maybe what was yesterday, Monday? You went to work. You drove your car to work, you could tell me that information, as opposed to non-declarative memory, which is more of things like knowing how to drive a car. So it might have been explicit at first, or declarative at first, saying, I know I need to push the pedal, I need to shift gears, all of the different steps, but over time it becomes non-declarative. It's sort of your skill learning, things that you can do automatically without thinking about it. And if I asked you how you did those things, you may not be able to tell me exactly how you're performing that task. So even within these non-declarative and declarative memory systems, there's additional subdivisions. I'm going to focus specifically on the declarative memory system and episodic memory. So semantic memory is more memory for facts. If I ask you what year it is, things like that. But episodic memory is more of autobiographical memory. So if I asked you about your past, you would remember certain things. You might remember where you met your spouse or partner. You might remember, the scene in which setting of which when your child was born, something like that. So I'm going to focus on that episodic memory, so events in your past. So the different types of memory can be divided by these different mechanisms. So first is the duration. So we have the sensory memories, which are shortest duration, short-term or working memory, which is a little bit longer, things that you're currently working on, and then long-term memory, where you can remember things all the way from your past. So who remembers something that happened when they were 3 years old? Are you sure? It's not quite clear how far back we can remember things. Some of your memories are actually implanted memories. So you might think you remember. I have a very strong memory from my childhood, which I am sure I don't actually remember from having experienced it, but I remember it because I've heard the story so many times. So that's sort of an implanted memory. It did happen to me, but my memory is not from when it happened, but because somebody has told me the story over and over and over. It's not quite clear how far back we can remember. And then these long-term memory for events is part of your long-term memory system. And these are all dependent on different brain systems. So I'm going to focus again on episodic memory, which is long-term. And then there's knowing what versus knowing how to do something. So this is the division between declarative memory, so knowing about something, versus knowing how to do something, like playing tennis or driving a car, like I mentioned. And then there's also the division of knowing about specific events from your past, which is episodic memory, or memory for facts, which is semantic memory. Now, I don't want to, there are these distinctions, but I don't want to give the impression that they're completely separate, or within the brain they're not completely separate. So a lot of semantic memories actually started out as episodic memory. So I might remember where I learned a piece of information at first, which is the event, which is the episodic memory, but over time that event or the context goes away and all I remember is the fact. So that information is getting transferred from episodic memory into semantic memory. So there's a lot of interaction between these systems. So episodic memory I find very fascinating. This is what I do research on. And I like this quote by Dan Schachter, who is sort of the father of modern research in memory, who also, by coincidence, happens to be the person who spoke about this movie, I think last year at Science on Screen. So he says, without memory, we wouldn't have a sense of self. We wouldn't be able to remember our personal experiences. So when people ask me why I study memory, I say, you need memory for everything. You wouldn't have a sense of self. You wouldn't be the person you are without remembering. And specifically, episodic memory, again, is autobiographical events that you can explicitly state. So what is encompassed within this episodic memory? It's memory for specific events. It may include sights, sounds, smells, feelings, meanings. All of this information gets encoded. Emotions also are encoded, so that's a big part of what this movie is about, is emotional memories. All of that is sort of included within your memory. Now, I want you to note how many different things that is. Sights, there's a visual system within the brain. Smells, there's a different area of the brain, the olfactory system. All of these are different parts of the brain that contribute to this memory. And it's a memory for that whole unified experience. So, if you remember, what you ate yesterday, you may be able to remember not only what things smelled like, but what they tasted like, who you were talking to when you were having breakfast yesterday. All of this experience is encompassed into that one event. So quickly, again, this is could be an entire course on the neural basis of memory. We'll talk about the basic system for episodic memory. So one of the main areas of the brain that's really important for episodic memory is the hippocampus. So this is at the level of the entire brain. So I study things at a systems level, so entire brain, rather than at a single neuron level, but at an entire brain level, the hippocampus and areas of the medial temporal lobe. These are structures that are within the brain, sort of in the center of the brain. I'll show you a picture in just a minute of what these structures look like. And the entire cortex. So why do I say the entire cortex? Well, as I mentioned previously, what is a memory? It involves sights, sounds, smells, feelings, meanings. All of this is processed in many different areas of the brain. So when you're talking about memory, it's not like there's one, well, pretty much any type of cognition. There's not just going to be one brain region mapping on to one type of cognition. This is especially true with memory. It's all over the place. So if somebody tells you, I know exactly where in the brain memory is, that is not true, because it's all over the place. You need all of this different processing to create a memory. So what does that look like? I think this is a video, but I don't know if it's going to play, actually. Let's see if it'll play. Well, it doesn't matter. Oh, I think it did come up. Hold on. Yeah, here we go. Is it going to play? Oh, wait. It doesn't matter because they give you the side slice here anyhow. So the important pieces here, again, is the hippocampus. So this is looking at the brain. This is the front of the head, the prefrontal cortex. This is the cerebellum at the back, sort of by the bottom of your head here. And this is a cut this way. So if I cut my head off on the side here, you would be seeing right in the middle of the brain. And the structures here, the hippocampus, which kind of goes up and around, and then the amygdala is this red part here. So the teal color is the hippocampus, and then the red part here is the amygdala. The hippocampus is really important for episodic memories. Keep that in mind when I talk about how we know that in the next slide. The other piece that's very important is the amygdala, which processes emotions primarily. But note how close it is to the hippocampus. So there's dense connections between those structures, which means our memories are very influenced by emotional information. So we know from a lot of research now that emotional information is remembered better than non-emotional information. So those are the main structures. But again, the hippocampus, although it's really important for episodic memory, it's only doing so because it's connected to basically the entire rest of the brain. There's lots of structures that feed into the hippocampus. So parts of the cortex up here, there's parts of the cortex that are processing sounds, visual information coming from the back of the cortex here. All of this information is getting filtered into the hippocampus. So how do we know that the hippocampus is so important for episodic memory? Well, sadly, there was a very famous case, patient HM. So there's neuropsych studies done on patients with brain damage that can tell us why this brain region is important to episodic memory. So does anybody know the story of patient HM? It's a very famous case from the 1950s when he had surgery. Anybody heard of it? Okay, yeah. So he had epilepsy that he had many other types of treatment first, which did not work. So medication did not work for him. So the doctors decided to go in and cut out the brain regions that were causing were the seat of the seizures. This is where the seizures were starting, which was primarily localized to this hippocampal region. So here's a normal brain. Here's what that structure would look like. In patient HM, they went in and cut that out on both sides, so bilaterally. They took out that structure, and it's shown here. Again, you can see it. This is looking, sorry, this patient HM is looking from the, like if you were looking up from the bottom of the head, that's what a normal brain would look like. That's what patient HM's brain looked like. And then this is what a normal brain would look like cut this way. So if you were like cut off the front of my face and you could see into my brain. So this is what that would look like. And then in patient HM, that's where he was missing all of that cortex. So the doctor had good intentions. This was not done unethically at the time. We didn't know what would happen. It did cure his seizures, but guess what else happened? He couldn't form any new memories. He had no more episodic memory. Now, he could remember things from his distant past, but he couldn't form new memories. So every day was like every time he did anything, 30 seconds later he would forget it. It was like he was experiencing everything new for, 30 years he lived past when he had the surgery, and everything he experienced seemed new to him. So we know that this region is important for episodic memory because you lose episodic memory when you have damage to this region. We also know that this region is important to episodic memory from more recent advances in functional magnetic resonance imaging, along with other techniques that are used to study brain function. So what this is showing here, I wanted to show you this picture of the MRI machine because they're going to show something in the movie that looks kind of like an MRI. They don't say what it is, but I think that they're kind of trying to imply that's what it is. So this is what an MRI machine looks like. What it's looking at is blood flow to brain regions. So when your brain is active, performing a task, a certain region is active or those neurons are firing, you're going to get blood flow to that region. And what the MRI is able to track is the blood flow to that region. And what we can see in an MRI image is not only the structure of the brain, but the function that's happening. So you can see if you present a stimulus over and over and over, you'll get activity in the region that's processing that information. So this is from a study I ran a few years ago. This is showing somebody remembering information. These are words that they studied previously and remembering that list of words. And what you see, I actually don't have the slice, but you get activity within hippocampus, but I also wanted to demonstrate with this image that it's not just hippocampus, it's also a lot of this cortical region. So the hippocampus would be inside, kind of underneath this cortex, but you also get lots of areas of cortex active as well. So you get the red means there's activity here over a baseline. So there's sort of a resting period versus when they're remembering information. So that shows that it's not just hippocampus, but hippocampus is important for episodic memory, but in conjunction with these other brain structures. This is a study, this is what's called a meta-analysis. So somebody took a bunch of studies on memory retrieval, combined them together, and looks at what regions are active when people are trying to remember information. So not only is it hundreds of individuals remembering information, but it's combined across a number of studies as well. And this is showing slices of the brain starting at the brainstem and then going up. So it's like you're looking at a slice of my head as you're going up to the top of my head. Starting from the brainstem, what you see is, again, a lot of activity going on in left prefrontal cortex. As you move up, you get areas of parietal cortex, and as you move up again, you get area at the top of parietal cortex, as well as hippocampus, which is right in the middle here. So those areas are all active when you're remembering information. So what does this show us? It's not just hippocampus, but it's lots of areas of the brain that are active for episodic memory retrieval. So this, again, is just one theory of why or how these different brain regions are connected with each other, interacting with each other to retrieve episodic memories. So remember I said that an episodic memory involves things such as sights, the sounds, your feelings. All of this information is combined into an episodic memory. So you need to process all of that information to make an episode. So the hippocampus acts as an index, or it stores pointers to those memories. So you can kind of think about this like the old Dewey Decimal System. So that your file drawer gives you an index, a number to go out and get each individual item. So the hippocampus is saying, okay, I need to index where all those pieces are, the sights, the sounds, and all of that, and combine it all into a coherent representation. So you have the visual memory is stored in the visual cortex, auditory memory is in the auditory cortex, and et cetera, for all the sights, the sounds, the meanings, all this information that's included in episodic memory. I'll give a visual in just a second. Maybe this will make a little more sense. But this indexing theory can explain the different processes of memory. So there's a lot of steps involved in memory. It's not just retrieval, but you need to first encode or form a new memory. Then you need to store that, which is called consolidation. Memories are strengthened over time so that you can maintain them up to 50, 80 years. And then there's the retrieval stage. So you need to take that representation that you stored and bring it back into your working memory or back into your consciousness at that moment that you're trying to remember it. So the hippocampus is thought to be involved in all three of these processes. So it's binding the information into a coherent memory during encoding. It's helping to strengthen those memories over time. And then it activates all of those other regions, the visual cortex, auditory cortex, all of that information is activated by the hippocampus in order to retrieve a coherent or a full representation of the past. So to show that just a little bit more graphically here, imagine this is a bunch of neurons sitting out in cortex. Let's say it's visual cortex and auditory cortex. Those are all groups of neurons in those regions. When a memory is encoded, you're getting activity within those regions, so you're processing visual information, you're processing auditory information, all of that. Those are all getting sent to the hippocampus, which activates a population of neurons within the hippocampus. So that's during encoding. So now how do I retrieve that information? Well, what's really interesting is you don't need a cue that involves all of the visual auditory information to be able to retrieve something. So this is, it's thought that olfactory information is a strong retrieval cue. So if I have you smell orange juice, it might make you remember an entire scene of the breakfast you had yesterday. So you don't need to be cued with all of the information, you just need a partial cue. So that happens within the cortex. So say I activate only a partial cue, so it's some of the representations that were happening at encoding, but not all of it. Well, that sends information to the hippocampus, which then goes back to the cortex and activates the entire representation. So this is like I've activated the areas of orange juice smell. Then that tells the hippocampus, oh, let's try to remember the entire episode of having breakfast yesterday. So it can reactivate the entire event. And that's why it's thought that the hippocampus is really important in episodic memory, is because it activates the entire context. Not just a single piece of information, but it reactivates the entire context that the event was encoded in. So again, this is just one theory of how hippocampus and cortex interact in episodic memory. So one of my favorite theories that I think fits most of the data for both animals and humans. So given this information, so a mini exploration of what episodic memory is in the brain, here's the questions that I thought of. I'm sure you could think of many, many more that we can discuss. I'm happy to talk more about other things in the question and answer session at the end. But these were sort of my 3 questions that I have for you when you watch this movie. So is it possible to identify the engram? The engram is this idea that you can have a neural trace, a specific set of neurons, specific set of biological substrate that's representing a memory. Is it possible to erase those memories? So you have to identify the engram and then find out how to erase it. And therefore, if you can do this, is it possible to have a spotless mind? Wouldn't that be nice? There's some things that I wouldn't mind forgetting. So keep these things in mind, and then afterwards, if you want to stick around, I'm happy to talk more about these ideas. Now, I don't want to say that I have any answers to any of these questions. Well, some of them I've got some insight on, but I do not have the definitive answer to any of these questions, but I would be happy to discuss it further with anybody who wants to stick around afterwards. All right, so I think we're ready to start.